I wanted to talk about landlords and tenants because it is being reported in the Telegraph that Labour is plotting a fresh crackdown on landlords with plans for stricter rules on evictions and requirements for costly eco-refurbishment. Let me just tell you what this is all about. Ministers are considering bringing in French-style hardship tests that would have to be carried out before landlords could evict tenants, effectively banning evictions in cases where renters were found to be worse off. Now, the Housing Minister, Matthew Pennycook, is understood to support this idea, which is already in use in France to reduce homelessness. The government also wants to bring back energy efficiency requirements, which would require landlords to make green upgrades to their homes with potentially uncapped costs, according to sources involved in the talks. It has raised fears of a fresh war on landlords who have come under increasing pressure from red tape and tax rule changes over the past decade, including the loss of tax breaks on mortgage interest and the introduction of stamp duty surcharges under the former Conservative Chancellor George Osborne. And it also comes as the government pushes forward with a proposed ban on no-fault evictions. And a former Conservative manifesto pledge included a renters reform bill, which failed to reach royal assent, as you know, before the general election. And due to a backlash from Tory MPs, Labour is going to revive it in its renters charter. And it is understood that the housing minister wants to amend that bill, currently going through Parliament, to include these so-called hardship tests. Now, Mr. Pennycook's previous amendment cited three examples where the hardship test should succeed. Let me just give them to you here. A tenant with terminal cancer, a tenant who would lose their job if evicted, and a tenant who would become homeless if evicted. You're also going to have increasing requirements on environmental grounds for housing as well, with these energy performance certificates, and it'll be interesting to see how that develops. Now, I'm just thinking this through, and I want you to think it through with me, because this sounds very seductive, does it not? That we're trying to look at rogue landlords, try and tighten up the system, protect renters. Landlords have got too much power at the moment, that's the feeling, and renters need to have more rights and protections. All very well, but is there another side to this where by clamping down so vigorously on landlords, and I can hear that your heart's bleeding for many of them, that actually you do more harm than good, and instead of helping tenants, you actually harm them by reducing their housing stock? Why? Because landlords simply throw their hands up and say, I'm out of this, I can't be bothered with this lark anymore, I've had enough, I'm selling up and moving on. And my question is this: will declaring war on landlords help or harm tenants? Will declaring war on landlords help or harm tenants? 0345 6060 973, text 84850. Ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. I would like to hear from you. If you are a renter, what is your perspective on this? Are you happy about this? Does it fill you with a great sense of satisfaction and security that there are going to be greater protections for you? If you are a landlord, how do you feel about it? Is this actually discouraging you from getting into the market if you're thinking about it, or actually encouraging you to sell out of the market because you simply don't want to deal with extra bureaucracy and cost and hassle involved? And if you're someone who's neither a renter or a landlord, what's your perspective? Do you think it's high time that renters were actually given more protections in this country? Or do you actually think that this is actually going to have negative impacts and actually harm renters who need a decent place to live? And if the housing supply goes down because they're all being sold off, that doesn't help renters in any way. Your thoughts, 0345 6060 973. Now, joining me to discuss this is Russell Conway, Senior Partner at Oliver Fisher Solicitors in Notting Hill in West London. Russell, thank you very much indeed for joining me. Good afternoon to you. What do you make of the reports that Labour is going to be looking at strengthening the rights of renters?
Well, there's nothing very new amongst these proposals, because when Matthew Pennycook was the Shadow Minister for Housing, he put most of these ideas forward as amendments to the Renters Reform Bill. So very little that we're seeing today in the Daily Telegraph is new. Most of these ideas have been put forward in the past. And I suppose they have to be viewed in the context of 270,000 homeless people in England, which is a very large number indeed. And I think where he's coming from is that there is still a cohort of landlords who operate out of slum conditions. They get rid of tenants who cause problems and are able to evict tenants because the laws in this country are far more flexible for landlords than anywhere else in Europe or indeed America. It's very easy to evict tenants in this country. And looking at the other side of the equation, the EPC certificates, and making sure that flats are in good condition, this, remember, was a Conservative Party idea. They originally introduced this, but the Prime Minister abandoned it a few years ago. And a lot of people in the housing sector feel that flats should be let in good condition. They should have good electrical certificates, gas safety certificates. There shouldn't be damp and mould. And whilst you mentioned that landlords shouldn't be tied up with red tape or rule changes, it's worth reflecting on the fact that the Grenfell fire was caused possibly in part due to the fact that there wasn't enough red tape and not enough rules to be followed. And when you don't follow rules and when there isn't a system in place to protect tenants, tragedies can follow. So I think the Labour Party is not going to war on landlords. It's basically taking the view that property should be let in good condition. They're also saying that landlords shouldn't be able to throw people out if it's going to put those tenants to considerable hardship. And you mentioned 3 examples of what that hardship might be, and I suspect a lot of your listeners might feel for a tenant who is suffering from terminal cancer or who's likely to lose his job or to become homeless if he is evicted. And that in itself segs into another problem. If somebody is thrown out of the private sector, they may well then become a burden for the council sector. And the council sector doesn't have the facilities to house all of these people. And just chucking people out of their assured short-hold tenancies, which landlords can do quite easily at the moment, means that a lot of local authorities will have to pick up the tab. And that in itself is becoming increasingly impossible.
Do you think, some of the things, Russell, that are talked about here, ending of Section 21 no-fault evictions, introducing 4-month notice period for landlords, giving renters the right to have pets, allowing tenants to make reasonable alterations to a property, National Landlords Register, all of these things. But one of them is very interesting, ending automatic eviction for rent arrears. Can you explain?
Well, at the moment, a landlord, if he has 8 weeks arrears of rent, he can go to court, he can serve a Section 8 notice, and the judge has no discretion. He has to make an order for possession. Now, some people may argue that 8 weeks arrears of rent is quite a small sum of money. It may be that somebody has had some problem in their life which can be corrected. A lot of people argue that 8 weeks is far too short a time. It's far too short a time compared to France or America and other jurisdictions. My guess is that if the Labour Party were to extend that to, say, 12 weeks or 16 weeks, that would be far fairer.
So it would still apply that if you don't pay for 16 weeks, you still go to a judge, and that they can then give an order that you should be immediately evicted. Would it make more sense for landlords and tenants to try and work it out themselves? And if, for example, in COVID, a lot of tenants suffered there, they simply had no income, or is this really designed, Russell, for people, landlords that do not have common sense to try and work it out with their tenants?
A lot of landlords don't work it out with the tenants. I mean, you're quite correct. During COVID, there was a different situation. And just to remind you, it wasn't so much landlords being generous. The government introduced a ban on evictions.
That's right.
During the time of COVID. So my guess is that a lot of landlords thought, well, we can't go to court to get them out. We might as well come to terms with the tenants. And a lot of them did. And in fact, the government ban on evictions, and that was a Conservative government, remember, was an extremely effective measure because it stopped, literally thousands of people being evicted for rent arrears when they weren't able to work, they had to stay at home, and some of them were extremely ill.
Okay, let's just ask one more question, Russell, which is this, and it's a critical one. If they're so keen to protect renters, why not introduce rent caps?
Well, rent control is something which part of the Labour Party is quite keen on. Another part of the Labour Party doesn't like the idea of rent control because, as you mentioned in your introduction, if you make the renting sector so unattractive, some landlords will withdraw from it. I mean, I'm simply a boring old lawyer. I'm not a politician. I'm not so sure whether rent control is a good idea. There is a market, and the market tends to work for itself. But at the moment, I don't hear anything from the Labour Party that they're going to introduce rent control. And I think, as you said in your introduction, it could be a difficult thing if it did.
Thank you very much indeed, Russell. That was Russell Conway, Senior Partner at Oliver Fisher Solicitors in Notting Hill in West London. Let me give you my thoughts on this. More protection for renters. Look, there are unscrupulous landlords out there that are frankly not doing their job properly, allowing people to live in completely uninhabitable, inhospitable conditions, and they should be called out and dealt with. So if this is going to tighten up on rogue landlords, absolutely fine. Absolutely fine. But you've also got to remember this, that there are lots of people out there for whom their rental home that they rent out is akin to a pension plan, a supplement to their pension. Now, if we're saying that you're going to make it more difficult now to increase rents above a certain level, I mean, we're not talking about rent controls, but there has been a lot of conversation about how much you can increase it by, whether it's reasonable or not, whether you'll end up in court about whether it's reasonable or not. I mean, look, one of my friends I mentioned before in Westminster, her rent was put up by 25% in 1 year. I mean, this is ridiculous. That is rapacious. It is confiscatory. It's rent seeking. I mean, that kind of behaviour should not be allowed. But if you're seeking to increase your rent by an inflationary level, which until only a few months ago was about 10%, you've got to think about why. Because landlords also have costs. They have costs. They have to pay plumbers, carpenters, painters. They have to pay for their mortgages as well, where the interest rates have been going up. Now they've just come down by 0.25%, but they were going up as well. So landlords have costs. If this is run as a business, it's like any business. You're trying to look at the other end, the income side of it. You've also got to look at the cost side for the landlords as well. I also think that whilst I understand some of the intentions behind this, I also think if you're going to clamp down on landlords, then you're going to have to clamp down on tenants too. You're going to have to say to tenants, right, this 4-month notice period, it's going to work both ways. So you're going to have to give me 4 months notice before you want to go backpacking around Australia. So it's not just going to work one way. And the flexibility that your short hold tenancy gives you, which might be a 1-year contract, it might be a rolling contract with 1 month's notice or 2 months' notice, whatever it is. Sorry. You're going to have to give more notice yourself. So it works both ways. If you're a tenant, how would you feel about having more restrictions placed upon you as well in return as a quid pro quo for this? And the final thing is this. I think this is actually a much deeper question for Labour around intergenerational inequality. Now, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing to focus on because we've talked about it many, many times before about, anyone under the age of 40 now being disenfranchised compared to older generations. And when you look at Angela Rayner, who's ultimately in charge of all this, she brought up in a council estate, left school at 16, tough background. Clearly, you might argue, this might resonate with her more because she cares about the issue very, very deeply, wants to address it. I understand that. I applaud it. All very well. Others would say it's a cynical attempt by Labour to cement the vote of under 40s, well, under 50s actually, that moved from the Tories to Labour in the last election because the Tories simply had no offer for them, and it is designed to cement that vote. Now, you might say that that's clever politics. They're politicians. Of course they want to secure the next election. Absolutely makes sense. But on the other hand, Is this storing up problems for the future, particularly with landlords who might just exit the market and you have a lower housing stock for renters pushing up the price, the very thing you are trying to avoid?